Hey guys, today I wanted to make a video on sociopathy and it leading to depression and addiction and how that's unavoidable. And so one of the main premises on this channel that I'm trying to communicate is that sociopathy is a method of enslaving people that is as effective as putting chains and collars on them, right? Where sociopathy preys on human nature. It's like there's a certain sociability. Like there's a reason we like dogs who are hyper sociable, right? There's a certain sociability in human beings, which is kind of an aspect of our moral nature. And most people in the modern world grow up in unhealthy environments, and so they have some type of psychological codependency, which makes them subject to, makes them subject to manipulation. And that's human, that's a vulnerability that many humans, maybe all human beings have. So the onus can't be on the individual not to get manipulated. It's kind of saying you got conned, so it's your fault. It's blaming the victim a little bit. um, it's like saying women who get raped should have worked out and been stronger. It's not their fault that it's their fault that they're weak or something. Like it's we all have our weaknesses. Our weakness doesn't justify other people taking advantage of it, right? So let's get into this dynamic of how it in like being subject to a sociopath or in relationship to a sociopath. And remember, if you're born to a sociopathic parent and your other parent is also a sociopath or at least or codependent, either one of those, um, it's very difficult. Like you are born into it. Those codependencies are created. The wounds are inflicted. They're created, and it's fostered over time. Like that codependency is purposefully fostered over time, so the psychological shackles are put on you, and it's really difficult to even recognize that you're in shackles. And by the time you do, it's such an immense psychological effort to get out. So again, in these things, we shouldn't blame the victim. So let's get into how depression and addiction is inevitable when you're subject to a sociopath. And many of us are, despite living in the US and being at liberty. A lot of us can be subject to sociopaths, right? So the sociopath will actively sabotage your success and then shame your failures. So up until I was like 23 or 24 years old, um, I was very shy, and so and we had that Pakistani Muslim patriarchal kind of male thing with our dad where like we couldn't say anything to him, and I was the oldest, and so I also had the pressure of trying to be good, like not being overly disrespectful or anything. But until 23 or 24, my dad would do things to sabotage my success and then blame it on me. And until like 24, I couldn't say anything, and I would actually feel a lot of guilt and shame about me as a failure. And then what happened is once I was able to articulate that it really wasn't me, like I had my flaws like we all do, but it wasn't really me. It was what he was doing that was really sabotaging the problems. And by 25 or 26, I had really addressed everything there was to address, really. And it was really his pattern of behavior, and I was very aware of it. But still at that age, I didn't want to like be like, I wouldn't be like, Dad, you're Satan. I wanted to be like, Dad, look, it's a psychological thing. I'm not saying you're doing it on purpose, but it's happening, and it's having a certain impact on my life. I don't have anyone else to like really support like becoming financially successful or like a medical career, like any type of getting set up for life. And you doing what you're doing is destroying my life, therefore, so I want you to become aware of this. But there's this thing, when you're not aware of what the sociopath is doing, you don't have any possibility of escape. But it's kind of benign in a way, their sociopathy, because it's they don't hate you, they're just using you for what they want, you know so because they're using you for what they want, not trying to destroy you, there's a little bit like where it's like the best the sociopath can do. You're still their slave, they're still using you for what they want, they're not letting you have you want what you want. because if you had what you want, you would be like free. If you became financially independent, you would be free of them. So they're using you, but they're not trying to destroy you. But the moment you recognize who they are, right? It's kind of like having slave property. You don't want to destroy your slave property, because it's valuable. So, but the moment you recognize what they're doing and who they are, see, all of a sudden that advantage they had of being a family member or a trusted friend or whatever, who could just kind of sneak in there and then control you, all of a sudden all of a sudden you've kind of created this barrier where the mask is off and they're recognizable. And the only time a sociopath has power is when they're not recognized. So once you recognize them, then they're afraid that you're going to expose them. And they're also doing this thing where they're trying to communicate to all, you're not letting them control you, and the thing that they would get from you is no longer available. So when that happens, they become your enemy. They become sadistic. They want to destroy you. And I don't know too much about sadistic psychology, but I do know that a sociopath doesn't always act sadistically. But if you're aware of them and challenging them, they will act sadistically. Um, so once you expose them, what happens is, or you start to expose them or challenge them at least, because at 24, 25, I was very polite, I was very loving. Despite all the loss my dad has caused me, I was still trying to engage him in a respectful manner. Um, but what happened following, once I started to engage him about like his pattern of behavior from 26 to 32 now, like 4, 5, 6 years, my father went from what happens, every vulnerability that I shared with him during that time, every maybe health issue I was having, which I requested help with, no matter what I did, he used the information, he took the knowledge of my vulnerability, and then he used it to destroy me, like to make it worse. If you have a health issue, then he would target like I can't tell you about my health issues and my addictions and stuff in this video yet, but the issue I would have, he would make it worse. And when he's making my key vulnerabilities worse and worse, obviously that has an overall impact on my life, right? So it ended up destroying my health in many, many ways. I had a psychological breakdown once, after suffering 17 years of my dad. I did kind of have a psychological breakdown. I still feel like I'm in some sort of cognitive decline afterwards. Um, Anyways, so he once you become aware of them and start to expose them to yourself and other people, they become your outright enemy, right? um Now when they become your enemy, they're causing these losses of what's meaningful to me. For example, my dad knew I wanted to get married young, but until I didn't recognize him as a sociopath, he kept delaying it. But once I recognized him, then he really started to delay it. So a 14-year-old is now 32 years old without the prospect of marriage or whatever, and family and kids and sexuality and all that type of stuff, and how meaningful it is at an earlier age. And so he used my whole thing around that, my kind of fixation on that, to manipulate me and to cause larger losses. He knew every year that went by, I would feel more and more loss. And so he made sure more and more time went by through manipulating our circumstances. I won't go into the details of that here. Um, and so when that was happening, it's very easy, like if there's a 17-year continuous loss, it's a very easy, despite yourself, to go into a depression. Like it's very easy, like if you're continuously suffering loss upon loss upon loss continuously without break, and there's no successes interrupting it, and no matter what you do or how you approach your problems or how you adapt or how you shift, no matter what you do, all you're doing is suffering loss after loss. That was my experience for 17 years. And so it's really easy, like I had my mom was a very strong person. She was a fighter, and she gave me that, and I was in my 20s, so I could fight. But once I started to get into my later 20s and early 30s, like I started to really feel the loss, and there's a certain depression that came with that. Um, And once you hit that depression, it's very easy to become addicted. There's certain addictions which you're vulnerable to in your teens and early 20s. We all know what those are. But then, when you hit your late 30s and you have this depression, then there's another kind of motive for addiction. Like when you have nothing and there's no ability to move forward on what you want and your dreams and stuff like that. um, that's when you really, you reach for something to make you feel good. And that's when you become really addicted to things. And this kind of happened to my mom. Like she became addicted to, her thing was gambling. She became addicted to gambling, uh, because, there was no way forward. She never had a way forward. Every time she would try to make a way forward for herself, my dad would destroy it or sabotage it in some way, the way he did with me. And so my mom needed to escape, and then her addiction kind of became, um, gambling. And the thing with addicted behavior is it makes all of your behavior repetitive. Like when you're addicted, you even have one addiction, what it does is all of your behavior becomes addicted, it becomes repetitive, because you need to sustain the same life so you can have the same addictive payoff all the time. And so your every day your life is in the same rut. You're doing the same things. You wake up and you eat and you drink in the same way. You go to the same grocery store. You live in the same place. You do the same things over and over and over, because they kind of allow for that addicted, whatever the addiction is. They're allowing the addiction to be served, and because you're attached to that thing, you're addicted to it. You're afraid to do anything differently, because unconsciously you think if you even do one thing differently, you won't have that thing that you're addicted to, right? So it makes all of the rest of your behavior addictive. And so if someone over 17 years has been forced into a state of depression, like a natural state of depression over 17 years, and then they're becoming addicted due to the depression that they're being forced into psychologically, in a state of total control and enslavement, um, then that isn't like a hedonistic addiction. That's an addiction that has been coerced. And see, one of the reasons I'm making these videos is I want to talk about the development of legality around sociopathy. And in order to do that, people really need to understand, like, the victim of a sociopath who's been depressed and has become addicted to something, and that's resulted in like immense damage to his body or his life circumstances or his life course. Then those are really damages that are owed to him by the sociopath, because we're human beings, and over the course of time it's impossible to not go into self-destructive behaviors and addictions and depressions if the sociopath is really kind of boxed you in. And what I'm trying to emphasize over and over and over again in these videos, that there is a way that the sociopath enslaves and binds people that is just like actual slavery. Like there's no escape from it, because first you don't, it's really difficult to recognize. If you're a moral person, it's like you don't want to think that way about it. But once you do really recognize someone as that, to disentangle, because they build these habits and dependencies and fostered codependencies, and their face itself is a trigger for certain contexts that they've programmed in, and they put you in a matrix for so long, so it's not easy to come out of at all. It's not easy to come out of. And so there is a way that, there's certain behaviors that we want to blame people that they're doing, it's their own fault. But the victims of sociopaths are actually forced into it over years. And therefore, the responsibility for even depression, addiction, and other self destructive behaviors, in truth, if the psychological dynamics are understood, the onus of those actually lies with the sociopath. Okay, so I'll talk to you guys later. Bye bye.